Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and this is going to be part 4 of our lecture series covering World War II. But before we begin our lecture proper, I'd just like to do a little recap and touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture we examined Imperial Japan and how the Pacific theater was becoming a highly contested zone between the United States and the Empire of Japan. Both powers have been expanding rapidly throughout the early 20th century. Japan had embarked on a series of military conquests, as had the United States. They were seeking to dominate the China market. If we remember back to when we discussed American imperialism, Albert Beveridge had openly stated that the power that controls China controls the Pacific, and the United States had designs on being that power. With the collapse of all the other powers, the door seemed to be wide open for the United States, to capitalize on this opportunity. And Japan, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria was definitely seen as a threat to all of that. Has had the rapid expansion of Japanese industry, which had been undertaken under the auspices of the German Empire at the time. We also looked at the Nazi-Soviet War, how Adolf Hitler broke the pact he had made with Joseph Stalin and invaded Western Russia, hoping that German technological innovations would be enough to carry the day over the Soviets. And that sort of just became his quagmire. We also looked at Roosevelt's quest for a third presidential term, something that was unprecedented in United States history. Nobody had won 3 terms. Many had lobbied for 3 or more terms. But nobody had won it until Roosevelt did in the 1940 election. And lastly, we ended with the realization that the Japanese and the United States were headed toward collision in the Pacific, and that the Japanese high commander, their high leadership, were increasingly coming under the sway of this idea that a swift and sudden attack would knock the United States out of contention. It would force them into retreat from the Pacific. And it is at that point, it is with that we'll continue, that we'll resume our discussion. So the Japanese understood that they would have to win using an overwhelming attack on the United States. They needed the war or hostilities to end quickly. If the war dragged on or raged for too long, they would be outproduced by the United States. They were keenly aware of that. They were keenly aware that the United States had the ability to vastly outproduce the Japanese, any Japanese capability to produce armaments. They crucially miscalculated the United States, the extent of the United States' will and determination. They did not understand that popular opposition would be aroused and inflamed by any sort of attack. That retreating would be the last thing that the United States would do after an attack. Pearl Harbor resulted in outrage. The last thing that any public official in the United States would have advocated was withdrawal from the Pacific. A war to the uttermost that would lead to the complete of Japan became the sole purpose of the United States. And far more Americans were interested in fighting in the Pacific than in Europe. Far more volunteered to go to the Pacific than in Europe. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not really a setback in any way. Was a setback, but not a major setback, and it was in no way decisive for the United States. but it was a very audacious move to make. It was amazing in many respects that the great Japanese fleet moved in complete radio silence, undetected across the vast Pacific, and came close enough to launch an attack on Hawaii. Torpedo planes and bombers made a truly stunning attack on Pearl Harbor. The surprise was almost complete had the attack began on Sunday, the 7th of February, 1941. The Japanese plane sank 18 United States warships, including the battleship the USS Arizona, which sank with more than 1,000 sailors on board, and the USS Oklahoma. The aircraft carriers and the submarine vessels, the vessels that were to play a very decisive role in the Pacific theater of World War II, were not harmed during the attack. The United States Navy was able to create a highly effective fighting force in the wake of that attack. And again, that was spurred by greater technologies in the United States, and of course a more willingness and eagerness to avenge Pearl Harbor and the fight in the Pacific by Americans. Now, many of the ships that sank during the attack on Pearl Harbor were sunk in very shallow. They sunk in very shallow water. They were later raised and refitted and commissioned, playing an important role in the later Pacific campaign. The reason that the aircraft carrier survived was that the Japanese aircraft lacked the fuel needed to search out and destroy them after the attack. The United States submarines had not been present at Pearl Harbor and survived also. The fleet was broken up into components. The aircraft carrier were off on their own, the submarines were off on their own, and the battleships were the only ones at Pearl Harbor. Now, the reason that the aircraft carriers survived, the mere fact that those two components survived, sort of in retrospect sent a pall over the views of historians and those who study it. It was a good surprise attack, but not an overall effective attack, since it did not really harm the complete fleet. And the United States submarine fleet in the Pacific will come to play the same role against Japanese shipping that the German U-boats did against British shipping during World War I. Now, there does exist a controversy with many holding the view, and when we talk about World War II, and particularly the attack on Pearl Harbor, many people hold the view that Roosevelt welcomed the Japanese attack as both a way to enter World War II and to kill off the isolationist policies that many people in Congress and across the Republic were holding on to. Now, it is true that the attack silenced isolationists at once, with many former isolationists now avowing to fight the Japanese to the bitter end. Germany and Japan were allies at the time, and within 2 days of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Germans declared war on the United States. And this solved a major problem for Roosevelt, as the American population would have wanted to fight the Japanese, but not the Germans. From the beginning, it was clear, though, that Germany was going to be the bigger threat. She had the bigger population, she was more industrialized, and Hitler, up until then, had been a martial genius as far as the world was concerned. The attack on Pearl Harbor led to an invasion scare in California. There were multiple scares, as a matter of fact, in California, a lot of panic. And it is hard to accurately convey the fears of a future mainland attack. Many thought that the attack on Pearl Harbor was a primer for eventual attacks on locations like Seattle and Los Angeles, which was becoming a large population center, and San Francisco. Many thought that attack and invasion was imminent. In the ensuing hysteria, rumors began to spread that the Japanese were being aided by Japanese Americans. The result was that in late 1941 and early 1942, the United States began to round up Japanese Americans and transport them to internment detention camps to prevent suspected traitors from influencing the outcome of the war. And really, that was just mass hysteria on a national level. Now, in hindsight, we know there was never a possibility of an invasion campaign. But for the Japanese and the Japanese Americans, they were forced to either give away or sell their property far below market value. They were sent into the camps far inland, covering up and the administration, the Roosevelt administration, went so far, had to cover up this act with magazine articles and using the mass media to explain that this was why this was happening. It was labeled a holiday for Japanese Americans. The deportations were given positive spins by wartime propaganda outlets. The situation was more reminiscent of a penitentiary with armed guards, barbed wire fencing, mandated sleep times, substandard sleeping quarters, regulated meals that largely consisted of excess packaged army supplies. It was a humiliating experience on many levels. For many young Japanese men, for young Japanese American men, all of this did not prevent the United States military from deeming them still eligible for military service. And many were conscripted to fight. Many were still drafted. But they were always sent to the European theater rather than the Pacific theater. And some argued that this was for their own good, that if you sent them to the Pacific, somebody might kill them, thinking they were an enemy. Whereas in the European theater, they would be known as American troops and not Japanese troops that were brought in by the Germans to trick the United States. Now, rearmament, as I said at the very beginning of our World War II lecture series, ended the Great Depression. In 1939, the United States Army was the 20th largest in the world. It grew exponentially, aided by the military draft and a number of men simply volunteering due to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, just as the Army found that many of the men who wanted to serve in World War I were unfit to do so, so too did the substandard health care lead them to make this startling discovery once again during the build-up for World War II. They found that many of the men who wanted to serve simply weren't healthy enough to do so. Now there had been improvements, but these improvements were far too slight to improve the quality of recruits. Many who wanted to fight were simply far below the standards, and the standards were set pretty low. You had to have a minimum height of 5 feet, minimum weight of 105 pounds. You had to have, it didn't matter if you had bad vision, as long as your vision was correctable. Half of your natural teeth, you have to have half of your natural teeth, and you could not be flat-footed. You could have no hernias, no venereal disease. Not a very discriminating set of requirements for a wealthy industrialized nation to have, but rejections rates were at 70%. In some areas, the overall rejection rate was 50%. Bad teeth and bad vision were the two main causes for rejection. An acute shortage of basic health services was the ultimate culprit. Now, the United States military faced a series of defeats in 1941 and 1942. The United States had maintained a presence in the Philippines since the Spanish-American War, and that presence was largely a military garrison to countercheck Filipino nationals' attempts to rebel and establish their own independent republic. Now, in the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the American commanders in the Philippines failed to make adjustments and kept their air fleets side by side. So when the Japanese attacked Clark Field, they were able to destroy most of the air fleet within minutes. It was a genuine shock to the American service members. National propaganda plus ethnocentrism had created an inflated sense of their own military capabilities that left them bewildered after the Japanese success. It was nothing short of horrified amazement. Now, the United States forces in the Philippines were defeated by an invasion force sent by Imperial Japanese invasion force, and then marched to military detention camps and what became known as the Bataan Death March, or simply the Bataan March. There was no relief prospects for the Bataan garrison because the relief plan called for aid to be sent from Pearl Harbor, which had recently been attacked. And to give you this purview of what the American situation was like, everybody expected the Philippines to be hit. That's why the fleet was split up. It was at varying degrees, varying lengths from the Philippines. The Philippines was supposed to be was the expected target because it was closer to Japan. The Japanese would come, attack the Philippines. MacArthur, who was the commander in the Philippines, he would lead that fight. Reinforcements and supplies would be sent from Pearl Harbor. Those battleships there would be the reinforcement, that first wave of reinforcements coming to aid those forces stationed in the Philippines, with additional support and supplies coming from West Coast stations. But of course, with that attack on Pearl Harbor, there was no relief that was available to come for the Philippine garrison. Now, the Bataan March were characterized by men falling out on the 60-mile trek. These men were either shot on the spot or bayoneted on sight. It had a galvanizing effect on the American public opinion during the war and after the war. And it really led to a sinking of their opinion of the Japanese. The martial attitude in Japan viewed being taken prisoner as shameful. The Japanese had earlier refused to sign the Geneva Convention, which specified the treatment of prisoners. The situation would lead to greater national and ethnic antagonism, as the Americans would exhibit an unrestrained hostilities toward the Japanese that they did not show toward the Germans or the Italians. Now, General Douglas MacArthur, the commander of the American forces in the Philippines, had been ordered by President Roosevelt to retreat, and he made this sweeping public declaration to return. MacArthur's promise to return to the Philippines and liberate the captives at Bataan became one of the great propaganda moments of the war. MacArthur was a war hero. He was a hero of the First World War, and he had been able to avoid lethal injury despite placing himself in constant danger. The Japanese had misread American resolve, which had become steely. The United States embarked on a campaign and strategy of total war. After Pearl Harbor, after Bataan, after the fall of the Philippines, there was nothing short of just animosity and putrid hatred in many segments of the United States society for the Japanese. And total war was the only option available for that. It was the only outlet possible. Now, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, switching from the Philippines to Europe for a moment, both agreed that of all the major belligerents they had to face, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany was the greatest threat. The pair quickly came up with a war policy known as Germany First. Joseph Stalin, the Russian leader, was under severe German attack and was eager to see the Americans and the British forces launch attacks on Germany in the West. That way, forcing Hitler to divide his forces in 1942. In 1942, all these discussions are taking place. Churchill, however, was intent on seeing the two totalitarian titans of his day, the communist Soviet Union and the fascist Nazi Germany, tear into each other for as long as possible. Churchill successfully convinced Roosevelt to delay launching an attack on the Germans in lieu of ground attacks. The British Royal Air Force joined the United States Air Force in massive bomber raids on German industrial centers. The United States and the United Kingdom returned to transatlantic convoying supplies and war material, the majority of which will be used during the D-Day invasion that would occur 2 years later in 1944. A year of hard campaigning led to the defeat of the Germans and the shocking discovery of the Nazi German war atrocities. Now, in the process of fighting the war, the United States transformed itself into a high-wage, high-employment economy with women and ethnic minorities entering the workforce in unseen numbers and taking on a number of jobs left by European American men. And we will break here, and we will come back with part 5 of our lecture series. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. The Pacific Theater is always interesting, and the European theater, because of the Nazis, has always gained more attention. But the Pacific Theater was really a baptism by fire for the United States and the United States military. And contrary to popular opinion, many people think that the war in the Pacific was largely a Marine Corps event with some naval aviation battles. The war in the Pacific, the number of soldiers sent to fight in the Pacific grossly outnumbered the number of sailors and naval aviators and naval amphibious landing and amphibious warfare or amphibious operation components. It was a truly unified war effort with all the service branches at that time, the Navy and the Army. The Air Force, as we know it today, was a component of the Army, much the same way the Marines are a component of the United States Navy. Both sides, and all those forces, all those service members sort of melded into this gigantic war effort that sort of illustrated that theory reserve that I spoke of earlier in our lecture. But we will crack that nut in our next lecture. But as always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. I am Ted, and I will see you guys next time for part 5.